Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Every Day is Friday, the show where we dive into the stories and experiences from people from all walks of life. Today, I'm joined by Anthony. He has a bachelor's in history and a master's in law. He's here to dive deep into the book of Job, World War I and World War II. If you love history, faith, and powerful life lessons, this is the episode for you. Let's get into it. Welcome to the show, Anthony.
I thank you. I'm glad to be here.
No, I'm excited to have you on. And for the listeners who may not be familiar with your line of work yet, could you give us a quick rundown of who you are, what you do, and why you do it?
Sure. So number one, I'm a veteran of the United States Navy. I served honorably for 11 years. I worked in a couple different fields while I was in the Navy. And then I decided that I wanted to pursue education outside the military. So using the GI Bill, I was able to get a bachelor's in history from the University of South Florida. And I also had, budgeted properly enough to afford a master's in law from Regent University in Virginia Beach. I just completed my master's this December. I'm kind of in the middle of a job hunt at this time, but I'm always looking to expand my knowledge on subjects, and things like the Bible and history have always been very important to me. And then I've also been writing short stories and poems over the past couple of years that hopefully one day I'll put into a book and publish.
That's great. And first, I want to dive into the book of Job and faith. I mean, what is the meaning? What's the main lesson from the book of Job?
So I would say the main lesson, I would say there's probably two. And the first one is that we are never going to fully understand why certain things happen to us. Um, and number two, it's that bad things don't just happen to bad people; they happen to good people too, and that's essentially part of life. And that you know, I personally believe that what God's trying to teach us through the Book of Job is that you know, while hardship and suffering, no one wants to experience that. It's essential to life, and it also helps us to grow as people. And sometimes the things we experience might not necessarily be for just our own benefit. Sometimes they're for the benefit of others. And of course, we never really understand that part when we're going through it. People tend to say, like, why are you doing this to me, God? Why is this happening? Um, but I would say, even from some of my own experiences in life, there are things I've been through that while I was going through it, I was like, why is this happening to me? I don't get this. But then later on, I realized that I could talk to other people about it and it might help them in a situation that they're going through.
Yeah, in the book of Job, I mean, his story raises deep questions. I mean, why do you think Job had to suffer so much?
Well, so right at the beginning, it basically talks about how Job himself was a good, God fearing man. And even God says that there is no other like him in the world. But that's only for him. Because it talks also in like the next line or two, it starts talking about his sons and daughters, and it says that they went kind of, we would use the terminology partying nowadays, but it uses in the King James version of the Bible, it uses the term feasting. And so there would be lots of food and drink going on there, and um they it says underneath that Job would go conduct sacrifices for each of his children, basically asking God to forgive them. And the way it kind of words it, it's like he wasn't 100% sure they were sinning, but he more than likely thought that they were. And so while Job himself is a good man, his children aren't. And but it also doesn't say anything about him actually like correcting them. It's like, "Oh, well, I'll just sacrifice for them, and that's fine." Like, he doesn't rebuke them for what they're doing, at least from what that passage is telling us. Um, And so in some ways, I think part of what God's trying to teach Job in that sense is, hey, you know, yes, it's good that you're a good man, but you have to like be good for others as well. And he does, of course, this is my interpretation because this isn't being said to him, but it's like, you weren't helping your own children. You're basically covering for them. And so, yes, he might be a sinless, God fearing man, but is he a good father? If he's allowing his children to misbehave and be foolish. Um, so yeah, it's like he might not himself be sinning, but there's other areas in his life that he is not meeting the criteria.
Yeah, I mean, even in suffering, Job remained faithful. What does the book of Job teach us about faith?
Well, so yes, Job, for the most part, does remain faithful at near kind of the middle to end of the book. He actually does start to get angry with God and starts to be like, I've done all these things. Why are you doing this? And he basically he kind of actually challenges God. He's like, come down here and tell me what I've done wrong. And at that, in this part, well, what led up to this was that, Job had these three friends that come from different parts of the world. And each of them basically criticizes him and says, clearly you've done something wrong because only bad things happen to bad people. So you've clearly sinned and you need to repent. Uh, to which Job is like, I haven't sinned. I didn't do anything wrong. Um, and so even his own wife gets to a point where she's like, you've screwed up, curse God and die. And, so it's kind of at this point that Job basically just says, I've had it. And he starts to be like mad with God. And, he's like, God, come down here and, you tell me what I've done wrong. And so in this case, God actually does in the form of like a great kind of storm, like manifest in front of him and begins to kind of take him on a journey through the heavens and basically says, you know, I created this. I put this into motion. I did all of these things. So who are you to question me? And, uh, you know, because he basically shows him like all these wonders of the universe and stuff. And even talks about these two beasts that are, one's Leviathan, which is believed to be like a great sea serpent. And then the other one, I can't remember off the top of my head right now, but, he's like, I created all these things and you don't really understand why certain things happen, but he was like, I've put all of this into motion. And if you think about it, like, with our knowledge of the universe today, we look up at the sky and we see all these stars. And many of the stars that we see, scientists tell us, like, went out, they died eons ago, and we're just seeing what remains of their light that's still traveling to our planet. And um, so just putting something like that into perspective, it's like, as far as we are aware, we're the only life in the universe. But there's all these other planets, there's all these other things that are going around. And so it's a perfect example of like part of that mystery where it's like, what if God had to create all those other planets, all those other solar systems, just so that this one planet could sustain life? And it kind of changes the perspective of the picture. And, so as God reveals all of these mysteries to Job, Job, you know, kind of feels guilty because he was basically like, you're a cruel God. Why do you do this? And so he repents and says, I'm sorry, God, please forgive me. And also and God does forgive him. And it also kind of shows how even when we screw up, if we ask for God's forgiveness, he will grant it. Um, and then the funny thing too is like God rebukes the three friends and is like, they're horrible people. And what they were trying to teach you about me is wrong. And he even says, but if he tells the friends, if you go to Job and ask him to pray for you, if he does that, I'll forgive you. Kind of even showing that, like, in a way, he's teaching humility to the others, because it's like you condemned Job, you acted like he was this horrible person, and so Job, yeah, he sacrifices and prays for them, and then they're forgiven, and in the end, Job receives a double portion of what was taken from him. So all of his land, all of his animals, he gets new children because earlier on his children all died. The room they were in fell down with the wind and crushed them all. So everything that was taken, he gets back, and he gets back double. Um, and it basically says that he lives the rest of his days, um, basically watching, his children have children and living a full life.
That
And, I think the core thing that Book of Job is trying to teach us is that suffering is inevitable, that no matter how good you are or bad you are, you will experience hardship in this life. And that's just kind of what it is. But, you know, but I do believe that these things, though we don't necessarily understand why they happen, they do happen for a purpose.
yeah, it's hard to trust in tough times. What does the Book of Job teach people who struggle with suffering and faith?
Well, so probably it's in like the first book of Job, um, where let me see, I have in my notes right here. Oh, it's right here. So after Job like loses all his family and all his possessions, it says he does mourn. Like he tears his clothes, he shaves his head, he kind of covers himself in ashes, which are all symbols in that time of like being in mourning. And he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And so basically, what Job is saying is it's like, you know, God blesses us, but he'll also take things from us. And, though he's sad, he still refuses to curse God. He's like, I accept it. And, like you said, yeah, it's hard to trust God, and it's hard to have a positive attitude when things are bad. Um, and I think that's like the true challenge is to fight through that hardship and to say, you know what, there's another passage of the Bible that says that God is the God of the mountain and he's the God of the valley, which essentially means that, he's there for us when times are great and he's there for us when times are bad, but he's always with us. Um, and yeah, sometimes we struggle to accept that. I myself have struggled to accept that at times. Um, and then I ask for forgiveness and I move forward, and that's, it's because that's the thing is it's not, it doesn't matter how many good works we do. It doesn't matter how often we pray. Not to say that we shouldn't do those things. It's about having a relationship with God. It's about, you know, going to God when things are great and thanking Him, going to God when things are tough and thanking Him, but asking to guide you through the process. It's that's really what it's all about. And I think a lot of Christians make the mistake that they're like, oh, if I do this many bake sales and raise this much money for the church, or if I say a kind thing to these people every day, that's going to basically earn my way into heaven. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do those things. You should. those are, good, kind things to do for people, but we can't earn our way into heaven. Salvation is a gift that God gives us when we ask for him to enter into our heart. And so, um, just like in Job, at the beginning when Satan approaches God and basically, says, well, Job only worships you and respects you because you have given him all of these things. And so that's when God's like, I'll allow you to basically take that all away, but do not lay a hand on him. So basically, like, you can't harm him, but you can take all those other things away. And that's what happens. And still, Job replies, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away.
Yeah, waiting on God is a big theme. And what role does patience play in the book of Job?
Well, so, a big part of the aspect of patience has to deal with, so not only do you have the devil tormenting Job, taking, his family from him, taking his possessions from him, but then you also have the friends and his wife. And when the friends approach him, they approach him individually. It's like, one at a time they come. And uh they're supposed to be friends, but each one of them kind of comes and is like, Job, you've clearly screwed up. And, you need to repent for what you've done. And because they all have this mindset that bad things only happen to bad people. And so, part of Job's lesson is that, he needs to continue to trust in God. And he also needs to have patience because, yeah, he's suffering, but his suffering is only a temporary thing. And that's, as humans, that's something we all struggle with. Like when we're going through hard times, we see it as this is the end. Like, I'm not going to make it to tomorrow. I'm not going to be able to pay my rent. I'm not going to be able to, um, you know, get that next bite to eat. I'm going to die. Like, that's the negative thinking that we all tend to kind of go to when things are hard. And what God's basically trying to say is like, I know it's hard, but please trust me, have faith. And, that's the patience. Cause honestly, like when we hear that, we expect, oh, that means tomorrow God's going to fix everything. And a lot of times that's not what happens. A lot of times God allows us to go through what we refer to as seasons in our life. And some seasons are good. Some seasons are bad. Some seasons are worse, you know, uh, and that's the test of patience is that, are you going to be that person that only praises God when times are good? And then when times are bad, are you going to look to other things, look to drugs, look to alcoholism, look to other vices to be like, oh, well, God's not there for me right now, so I'm going to go do this. But when God comes back, then I'll go back. Yeah. And now, not to say that, we don't sin, everyone sins. And, when we sin, we should repent to God and ask for forgiveness. And the goal is, I heard another pastor talking about this recently is that um, I might be, I might not be sinless, but the goal is to sin less, if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. I'm sure
Yeah.
the listeners will understand that one if they really dive into it.
Right.
And some people are in your life for a reason, and some are there for just for a season. And
Right.
that's some powerful words you just spoke there. And when God finally speaks to Job, I mean, what's your take on his words?
So the way I look at it is that, you know, in a lot of ways, God is sympathetic to Job because he's God. Honestly, he could have just chose to smite Job right then and there and said, "How dare you challenge me?" and called it a day. But instead, he takes the time to show Job things that Job clearly can't even comprehend and be like, "Look, I know you don't get this, but that thing right there, I made that. This thing that happens over here, I allow that." You know, he didn't have to do that. Like he could have just said, "Sorry, Job, you lost the game. Bye." But instead, he literally takes the time to not only reveal himself to Job, but then to show him all of these things and then have mercy on him. Because Job realizes that he screwed up and then asks for forgiveness. And, then the other thing too is he even, when it comes to like the friends, he even looks at the friends and he's like, these people are the wicked ones, for they've basically misunderstood me and have wronged you. But if you pray for them, I'll forgive them. So he's basically also like giving Job a bit of power to be like, it's your choice. And, but the thing about God is God is omniscient. And so, his concept of time isn't the same as ours. He basically sees everything all the time as it's happening, as it happened, as it will happen. So I believe he personally knew Job was going to forgive them, but he still vocalized that and gave Job that ability to do so. And that's what he does for a lot of us, well, all of us. And, because at the end of the day, you know, salvation is simply the act of us coming before God, admitting that we're sinners and asking him to be in our lives. And so, he, a lot of people try to make this argument that God is cruel, that, he basically wants us to be a slave to him. Well, if he did that, then there's no need for us to ask for his salvation. Instead, he gives us that free choice, the free will. And, he's like, I want you to be in my kingdom, but you have to choose that. He's not going to force us. It's a choice that we all have to make.
No, so true. I mean, there's always there's two sides. And now, if Job's story was written today, do you think people would react differently?
Well, it's funny that you asked that because earlier when I was thinking about this, there's an episode from the TV show Family Guy, and from its like earlier seasons where they make reference to the book of Job. And it's not the first time I've seen like a modern media make reference to Job, but when they focus on it, they tend to miss the key points and they tend to focus on God as like a bully. And they're like, "Oh, look at what God's doing to this poor man Job." You know, he, and they even have like a gag in Family Guy where it cuts to God in the church being like, "Oh, I hate when they bring this part up." And I think, especially in our modern, more secular world, um, especially like a lot of arguments that atheists will make, they'll say, if God is so good, then why does he allow bad things to happen? And I think that's the way, if it wasn't being done by a Christian, say it was like a Hollywood adaptation or something, they would probably depict God as this horrible, monstrous creature, and that Job is this poor, innocent man who's just being tormented. They basically like take God and the devil and reverse their roles and be like, oh, you know, um, God's evil. And then they'd probably portray the devil as being the one who's like, oh, but poor Job, I just wanted to see what you do, God. I didn't know you were going to do this to him. Like, because that's another common trend in media nowadays is depicting the devil as being a sympathetic being when if anyone's ever read the Bible and really studied it, they'd know that there's nothing to be sympathetic towards the devil. Um, he is evil incarnate, and he delights in our torment. And his end goal is to take as many of us with him into his eternal damnation. You know, but a lot of media tries to portray the devil as, oh, you should feel sorry for the devil. He just questioned God, and and does he really deserve the punishment he had for questioning God? No, he tried to lead a rebellion against God, and he took 1/3 of the angels with him. You know, and so and well, see, that's the thing though, is like in our modern secular world, society teaches that we ourselves are our own God, that we control our destiny, that if we want something, we should just go for it, regardless of what happens to someone. Or they'll say, as long as no one gets hurt. Well, people have different definitions of hurt. Some people might say, oh, well, and I don't want to get political, but for example, we recently had this man shoot the CEO of a health insurance company. And some people are praising that and acting like, oh, he's a vigilante. He's this champion of justice. But God would say, that man murdered. He had no right to do what he did. Now, I don't know that much about the other individual. I don't know how good a man he was, but that's not the point. The point is that the Bible says, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. We're not supposed to take vengeance into our own hands. And so this man murdering this other person is an act of vengeance that God clearly would not accept. And on top of that, the fact that so many people seem to celebrate that kind of also shows where their relationship with God is. And another thing is like the old expression, to put the shoe on the other foot. Um, if the roles are reversed, if we were that person walking down the street, or we knew that person walking down the street that got killed, would we still be okay with it? Because if you're okay with someone being murdered simply because you heard they might have been a bad person, or they might have done bad things, but you're not okay with that potentially happening to yourself or someone you love, well, then that's what I like to call situational ethics. It's saying, oh, well, it's okay as long as it doesn't happen to me, but don't let it happen to me. And see, a lot of people nowadays practice situational ethics where if someone gets robbed or their business gets burned down, they'll be like, oh, well, that guy deserved it. But is it okay if it happens to you? Well, no. Situational ethics.
No, I love the way you put that. And I mean, Job isn't the only one who's faced trials. I mean, how does his story stand out?
Um, well, one thing that's interesting is that uh, most of the Bible is told from the perspective of the Jewish people, especially the Old Testament's pretty much all the Jewish people. Job is different because it takes place in a land that is far from where the Jews live. And the various people named in it uh, are names of various people groups that would have come from certain areas around the Middle East, but would not be Jews themselves. But but they do follow God. And so that's the thing, is that, those who are not Jews are called Gentiles. And so it's interesting that in the Old Testament, you have this book that's basically about a non-Jew, a Gentile, who loves God and is a good man, but has to face all these trials. And, but he still remains faithful and he's still blessed. And, then we see this continuation once Jesus comes, Jesus opens the door for Gentiles to start to be saved. Because prior to that, the only way to be saved biblically essentially was to become a Jew. You had to adopt Jewish custom, you had to be circumcised, you had to obey the Torah, you had to basically convert to Judaism to be saved. But when Jesus comes, he opens the door for all of us to be saved. And, you know, um, and it begins this journey through the New Testament, like after the Gospels, the book of Acts and the other books that follow, all essentially are, you know, the apostles, the disciples traveling to various parts of the world teaching about Jesus. And that's where like the various books, like Corinthians, that's a those are letters written, I believe, by Paul to the Church of Corinth. And these other, so all these other books are letters that are basically being written to these specific churches to tell them, hey, I heard you did this and this is good, but you also did this and this isn't right. Um, but they're also examples to all of us as to how we're supposed to live. And so, yeah, like one thing about the Bible that's interesting is a lot of people will say, oh, well, once the New Testament began, like you don't need to pay attention to the Old Testament. And I would say that's completely wrong. Um, the Old Testament is like the foundation of a building. Without the foundation, the building isn't going to stand. And so we do need to understand the Old Testament. And also, there are things in the Old and New Testaments that mirror each other. And I think that's the thing is like, this book of Job is about a guy who's not a Jew, but he's a godly man. And, we don't really see too much of that again until the New Testament comes around when you start to have the new Christian converts. Because that was another thing is that when the Gentiles started to become Christians, a lot of the Jewish Christians didn't really agree with that. And they were like, but they're not Jews. They eat things that we can't eat. They're not circumcised. They don't do the same things that we do. And this was actually like a point of debate is that should all Christians essentially have to become Jews? And there was a big kind of meeting about this. And, of course, they prayed and they also came, I believe it was Paul. I might be wrong, but I believe it was either Paul or Simon Peter, but they came to this conclusion that as long as they believe, that's what's important. We shouldn't force another people to give up their customs just to be saved. Like their belief is what's important. And they said so, but they said if people want to essentially become Jews, they can do that. But it's wrong for us to tell these other people that now believe in Jesus, hey, you can't eat that anymore. You can't, you're going to have to become circumcised. You're going to have to do these things. Um, they were like, no, you know, uh, and that doesn't mean that all aspects of culture are good. There are some aspects of cultures that are not so good. Human sacrifice was a cultural thing in a lot of ancient cultures. That was not a good thing. Um, and so we leave behind the bad and we embrace what God has for us.
No, I love that takeaway. And I know you mentioned you were a poet. Do you have anything to share with us today?
Sure. We've focused so much about the book of Job and, especially this concept of you have to be patient and you have to fight through adversity. And so I wrote this poem last year, and it's called "The Wall." And I wrote it. I was inspired to write this because of not only times that I was going through hardship, but also uh, some of the hardships that some of my loved ones were going through. And so I'll read it to you now. And this is "The Wall." I hit the wall. The stone was cold and hard, and the pain was excruciating. I fell backwards to the ground and stared at the seemingly impenetrable object before me in the darkness. I cried and wanted to give up, but after some time, I looked back at the wall and said, "One more time." I hit the wall again with all my might. Still, it did not break or move. The silent object almost seemed to torment me. Again, I said, "One more time." I hit the wall again and again and again, but nothing seemed to get through. I was just about to give up when I saw that a small piece of the wall had been chipped off, giving me a new area to focus on. So I hit the wall with a new purpose, direction, and focus. It took time, and I often had to rest, but I kept hitting the wall. And then one day, a small light shone through a hole in the wall. I hit the wall harder than ever before. I hit it till my fingers ached and bled. I hit the wall when others told me to stop and said I was a fool. And then one day, I hit the wall and it shattered like glass. I walked past the broken stones and felt the sun's light and warmth upon my face. I hit the wall and it no longer exists. And now I have peace.
I love that. I resonate with that.
Thank you. And yeah, I like to write poems and stories that have positive endings, but tend to start with struggle. And because, struggle is essential in our lives. And I think that's also what the book of Job is trying to teach us is that if we're going to learn, if we're going to grow, we have to face challenges, no matter how unpleasant they are. And, so I was really inspired by some of my own personal challenges, plus, like I said, the challenges of loved ones and others that I have known. And, of course, like the part where it said others, kind of said I was a fool and that's kind of a reference to Job there and his three friends being like, "Oh, you're an idiot, Job. Curse God and die." You know, because that's the thing too is like a lot of times when we're facing struggle and adversity, others aren't going to understand. They're not going to get it, and they might think that we've done something wrong. They're like, because there are people who still have that mentality that, oh, you're having a hard time in life, then you screwed up somewhere, you know. And yeah, I mean, it just sometimes, like the old saying goes, life gives you lemons, you know, but when you do, you make lemonade.
No, I'm sure a lot of listeners out there are resonating as well with it. And thank you for sharing that. That was wonderful.
You're welcome. Thank you. I'm feel happy to share it, and I've written so many other ones too, and hopefully one day I'll be able to put them all into a book and publish it.
No, I'm looking forward to that. I really am. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you have in the future as well for your future poems. I mean, just keep on chasing after your dreams because your dreams won't chase you. That was great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
And if you're okay with, we're going to move on to the next topic here, and we're going to jump into a whole nother genre into history of World War One and its impact. If you're ready, I'm ready.
Yeah, let's go.
Uh, Big question that a lot of people don't know: what caused World War One?
So the biggest there's many things that actually lead to World War One, but of course the incident that basically sets it off into motion is what's often referred to as the shot heard round the world. And that was the assassination of the Crown Prince, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire by a Serbian nationalist as he was touring through some of those kind of contested areas. Now, while this initially should have been probably a conflict specifically between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Serbia, it kind of boiled over. And part of it was because Austro-Hungary, a lot of historians basically say that they were itching for a fight. And the justification for that is because when the Austro-Hungarian Empire presents its list of demands to Serbia, the list is so outrageous that it's basically, they're like, there's no way Serbia could have ever agreed to any of this. And so essentially they were like, Austro-Hungary was just looking for a fight. And they were using, the Archduke's assassination as their, okay, we have a casus belli for war now. You know, um, what's interesting about World War One in how it begins is that the reason it becomes the conflict it is because of treaties between nations. All of these European powers had treaties with one another in some form. And so the minute, Austria begins to basically say, Serbia, we're going to come after you, the nation they had a treaty with decided to be like, oh, well, if you come after Serbia, we're going to get involved. And then, Austro-Hungary is like, hey, Germany, you're going to help us out. And they're like, yeah, we'll help you out, and all these other various nations all basically decide to jump in on a conflict that's really only between two nations. Um, and there's various reasons why this happened. Part of it's because for like the past 200 years before this event, the way European powers basically gained control and influence was through warfare, and their wars tended to be shorter conflicts, and they would basically take chunks of territory and then sign a ceasefire and be done. Uh, and so a lot of these European powers were like, oh, well, we'll go to war for a few months to a year maybe, and then we'll like get some land here, they'll get some land there, and everybody will be happy. But what they had kind of failed to learn was from the American Civil War, because the American Civil War lasted for years. And one of the biggest technological developments that came out of that conflict was the Gatling gun, which is the precursor to machine guns. And also, you had new inventions in artillery, you had new inventions in military tactics. The stand in a line formation and shoot at each other mechanic, that ended pretty quickly because it didn't really work anymore. Um, and especially as firearms became more accurate, because the thing about it, like a musket, is a musket, it's not very accurate, and that's part of why they did that stand in a line formation and shot at each other, because it basically was a way of trying to increase the potential casualties. Since everyone's all stacked together like that. Um, but with rifling, where you basically, you take the barrel of a gun and you basically have like a giant screwdriver that goes down it and creates grooves so that when you fire the gun, it's just like how a football player, like they put a spin on a football, it puts a spin on the bullet, which makes it more stable flies farther, keeps its track longer, and becomes a much more deadly and accurate weapon. Uh, and by the end of the Civil War, one of the things that really gave the Union advantage was that the amount of rifles that they had given to their troops, also breech loading technology, uh, which with a breech loader, you take the weapon, you open it pops, kind of like a double barrel shotgun, how they open like that. That's called breech loading. You put the rounds right in there, you put it back together, and then you fire. Whereas before that, the way to reload your gun was you literally had to shoot, put it down, get powder, pour it down in there, get a musket ball, drop it in there, get a ramrod and poke it down in there, and then fire and hope that by the time you did all that, you hadn't already been shot. Now with breech loading, you shoot, you crack the breech, put the next round in, you crack it, shoot again. It sped up the process. And so because of all of these newer advances in military technology and tactics, uh, when the war, plus industrialization, the ability to, with factories, mass produce weapons on a scale that had never been seen before. Um, this conflict that they thought might only last a few months to maybe a year or two quickly just draws out into a stalemate. And that's why on the Western Front you have the trench warfare, where you know you just you have thousands and thousands of troops that are just stuck in mud ditches, that from time to time will charge at each other, and the machine guns will basically just tear them apart, or the artillery will just blow them to pieces. And so, you literally just you're not going anywhere. Or, you might take some land but then have to retreat and vice versa. And that's why, like, between the two trenches, you have the area that's called the no man's land, where it's basically assumed that if you're going up there, you're more than likely going to die. And, of course, because of these new developments in warfare, well, warfare always pushes technology forward, especially the technology of how to kill. And so you begin to have, I believe it was the Germans were the first to utilize it, but you begin to have developments into chemical warfare with mustard gas and other chlorine gases and other things. And part of what made them so deadly was that they're heavier than air, so they sink, they go to the ground. So if you throw these canisters into the trenches, the whole trench just fills with that gas. And if you either don't have a gas mask or you can't get out of the trench, you're going to either die, or if you live, you're going to be, you're probably going to have neurological issues the rest of your life, or you're going to have other serious health side effects. And that's an interesting point on that is that, Adolf Hitler fought in World War One. Even though he was Austrian, he enlisted in the German army because the Austrian army wouldn't take him. They thought he was too skinny, and they figured that he wouldn't be a good soldier. But the German army was basically like, we'll take anybody. And while he was fighting in World War One, he survived a mustard gas attack. Uh, and so, and that's infamous. They say that's why he went to that infamous mustache, because he used to have that like curly long mustache that a lot of like the Germans and Austrians had. But he apparently couldn't get his gas mask on. It wouldn't make a seal. So even though he had the mask on, he still inhaled some of that gas. So after that, he cut the mustache down to that little, rectangle. Um, and then, basically kept it the rest of his, miserable life. Um, but Yeah, the interesting thing about World War One is that so not only do you have all these nations with treaties that basically all jump in on each other, and they think it's going to be a fast war, and it quickly just goes into stalemate. Um, the loss of life, especially at the first half of the war, is so great and traumatic that the that even like when the war finally ends, uh they called it the war to end all wars because there had never been a worldwide scale death of that magnitude. And they thought with these modern weapons, like it's not going to happen anymore. Um, Sad to say they were wrong. Uh, but hindsight is 2020, as they say. And what's interesting is that the world we live in today is a byproduct of both World War One and World War Two. And the Cold War, of course. But, the Cold War wasn't so much of a shooting war. It was more of a political game, espionage type war. Of course, there was Vietnam and these other proxy conflicts that happened. But, and you know, so after the end of World War One, the major empires of the world either were significantly weakened or completely fell apart. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses. The German Empire collapses. Uh, and then right after World War One, they go into a civil war, and after that ends, they reform as the Weimar Republic, uh, which basically lasted until the Nazis came to power. Um, but also the Ottoman Empire, which basically controlled the majority of the Middle East, collapses. And while as the Ottomans would have been thought as being more Western in their thought and tactics, they were, Islamic empire. After their collapse, the Middle East kind of destabilizes again. And you have the rise of Wahhabism in what becomes Saudi Arabia. And with the call for jihad and the holy war, and so the Middle East kind of completely destabilizes once the Ottoman Empire ends. Um, and then uh, you know, when you have the countries come to the Treaty of Versailles for the surrender, um, it of course like the history is written by the victors. Even though all the nations had in some way committed atrocities, had done other things, basically the blame gets kind of solely put on Germany. And it becomes a how do we punish Germany thing. And that's where you have a huge debt is placed on the German people that I saw a video a few years ago that a historian said that had all the other things never occurred and Germany just stayed on track to try to pay that debt off, they wouldn't have actually paid it off until just a few years ago. Um, that's how much of a debt was incurred on them from that. They were told that their military had to be gutted. They couldn't have U-boats, submarines. They couldn't have um, like their major like naval units like battleships, and that had to be scrapped. They were limited on tonnage of vessels. All these other restrictions and, of course, which the Nazis used all of this to justify their rise to power and say that, look, the world just decided to punish us. And, that when you have a people who are disenfranchised and are looking for answers and an angry guy gets up and says, I know why everything sucks and it's because of this. And people they buy that, they eat it, and they're like, yeah, that's right. that's why this is bad. It's because it's what that guy said. Um, because even George Orwell, who's famous for books like Animal Farm and 1984, um, he was also a literary critic, and he read Mein Kampf, Hitler's book that he wrote while he was in prison, and he basically said that, on a technical writing standpoint, it's like amateurish. It's, not a very well written book from the point of somebody who writes books. However, he said it told people exactly what they wanted to hear. They were angry, they were upset, and this guy says, I know why you're angry and upset, and this is why. And that's why it became like a bestseller. Um, and and then, so you have, World War, and this is what's interesting about World War One is that we focus on World War II a lot in our history classes in the United States because of the impact we played in it. Our impact in World War One is kind of minor. We only really get involved in the last year of the conflict. We did fight in some battles, but uh, like it's debated how much of an impact we really had. But World War One itself, I think, should be taught more because it really sets the stage for the world that we live in now. And because it basically ends the major empires or severely weakens them. Like even the British Empire was like severely weakened. The French Empire basically, was ending. Um, and then, you have the interwar period where, you know, you have the 1920s come around. Well, first you have the World War One, then you have the flu of 1918, which, they used to refer to as the Spanish flu. They say that's not like politically correct anymore to call it that. Um, but that was a major flu virus that wiped out a lot of people. Uh, and it lasted for about 2 years. Um, so after that happened, then you have the 1920s come around, which, you know, had been a great time for us because of all the money we made through bank loans and and playing the market. Uh, and it also is what allowed countries like Germany to begin rebuilding themselves because they had taken all this loans from us. Um, and that was great until 1929 rolled around and the stock market collapsed. And part of why the market collapsed was number one, we were kind of already messing with it more than we should, but we knew that things were bad. We tried to call in these loans. Everybody had spent all the money. Germany was like, sorry, we spent all that money. We don't have any money to give you back. And all these other, nations. And so um, the stock market collapses and the Great Depression begins. And if you think about it, I mean, talk about struggling through adversity and that you have, World War One, 1914, 1918. Then you have the flu, 1918 to about 1920. Then you have, a few years of prosperity followed by Great Depression. And what a lot of people don't understand is like it wasn't just the United States affected by the Great Depression. Most of the world went into that because they'd all borrowed money from us. And now we had no money left to give. And, not only do you have the Great Depression happening, but because of like over harvesting crops and other things, you have the Dust Bowl that begins and starts to kill a lot of the remaining crops in the United States. But also, like, there are stories of children dying from just inhaling so much dust that it filled their lungs. They couldn't breathe right anymore. Or if they lived, they would get like a lifelong illness. Um, almost as if they had been working at a coal mine or something. Uh, and so you have all these kind of catastrophes kind of going on back to back. And then the 1930s rolls in. And see, that's the thing, is part of what allowed the Nazis to gain as much power as they did is because Hitler kept saying that there was going to be an economic catastrophe. And so when the Great Depression occurs, suddenly all the Germans are like, oh, he was right. And that election cycle, the Nazis gain a majority control of the German parliament. And then they begin to work on effectively eliminating all their political enemies and taking over what remains of the German government. Um, and so as you have that going on, you also have Japan, the Empire of Japan at this time, which they did participate in World War I, but their conflict was mostly between themselves and Russia over some disputed territories. And the Japanese felt personally insulted because even though they showed up to the Treaty of Versailles, they weren't really shown much respect. They didn't really get much say on what was going to happen. Uh, and so their mind, they're like, well, the only way we're going to get respect is if we start conquering everybody like how the West does. Um, and so for Japan, they begin that struggle of conquest against China. And so they begin to invade China in the mid 1930s, and especially there's a very infamous incident called the Rape of Nanking, where they sacked the city of Nanking and committed all kinds of horrible atrocities. There's a reason it's called the Rape of Nanking, and they begin this bloody campaign through China, which at the time China was kind of already on the brink of collapse because the Chinese Empire had come to an end in there's kind of two dates, because in 1912 the last emperor was basically told that he was no longer in control of the country, but he could kind of keep his title. Um, and then in the 1920s, he was basically told you have to vacate the imperial palace. You're gone. And China had gone into a state of civil war, where there was, I think, 4 or 5 major factions, but the two most prominent were the Chinese Nationalist Army, um, and the Chinese Communists. And the Chinese Communists were led by Mao Zedong, who later would become the first, premier of the Chinese Communist Party when they took over. Um, but so Japan invades China and starts that conflict. And now at the time, we were uh, we were trade partners and we were allies with the nationalists in China. And so we were also trading with Japan, specifically oil. And we begin to tell them that, hey, we don't like that you're fighting these other people that we're also allied with. So you need to stop that, or we're going to cut off your oil supply. Which the Japanese were like, no, this is a thing between us and China, and you're not going to get involved. So we kept our word and we cut off our oil and our trade, which Japan as a nation has no natural oil deposits. And that's a resource they've always been deprived of. And of course, in an age of tanks and aircraft and ships, oil is like your biggest thing. That's what's moving everything. That's your lifeblood of war. Uh, which this puts Japan on the path to begin to say, well, we got to do something to bring the Americans back to the table. And that's how the plan begins to come to fruition about, well, if we can attack the Americans at Pearl Harbor and destroy the Pacific Fleet, because that was the headquarters of the Pacific Fleet, they won't be able to challenge us on a naval basis, and we'll be able to force them to give us what we want. And so that begins that process. They begin to plan that out. to which Admiral Yamamoto, who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, he had actually he had studied abroad in the United States and had seen it firsthand, and he was completely against this plan because he said, "I've been there and I know what this country is capable of." And he's like, "You do not want to do this. If you tell me to do it, I'll do it." Because he was, he's a patriot to his nation, but he was like, "I don't want to do this." And they didn't listen to him, so he began to, help plan this. And he knew that if they didn't get the carriers at Pearl Harbor, that it was going to be basically a loss for Japan. And he's infamously quoted uh, when we have awoken the sleeping giant. Uh, After he learns that the aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor at that time. Um, so as that's happening, you also have tensions now between, you've got Nazi Germany growing in power and basically defying all the treaties and just building whatever they want. You have, especially, they signed an agreement with the Russians where they basically exchanged tank technology and experience with one another, which that was something they weren't supposed to do. You've also got, in Italy, you have the rise of Mussolini to power. And of course, Mussolini essentially creates the concept of fascism, uh, which is, the symbol of fascism is a bunch of sticks wrapped around an axe that are tied together. And it's actually an old Roman symbol, and it essentially means that, individually we're weak, but united we're strong. And so and Hitler is very inspired by Mussolini. Um, and so, when Hitler takes over the Nazis, he basically, incorporates a lot of Mussolini's ideals, but then adds some of his own. For example, the swastika is an ancient Buddhist symbol, but the way that it's traditionally shown, it's not crooked, it sits on one of the flat parts. But when, he took it and he bent it for his, to be his symbol, and then incorporated, he made sure it was black on a white background and then with the red band around it, which the black, white, and red were the symbols of Imperial Germany. So this was his way of saying we're forming a new German empire. And that's why they referred to Nazi Germany as the Third Reich or the Third Empire. Um, and so, uh, so then you got Germany begins to prepare for its invasions. Specifically, they start with Poland in 1939, and they basically do a false flag operation where they make it look like the Polish attack them on one of the borders to justify going in and taking Poland. And now, uh, what basically gives Germany the advantage, at least in the first half of the war, is their blitzkrieg tactic, where they basically, using tank warfare, and especially with radio now, they're able to coordinate fast movements with the tanks, and they're able to get past the enemy's infantry lines, and attack the command centers in the rear. And then the German infantry comes up behind and basically mops up what's ever left. Now, the funny thing is that while this tactic works for like the first half of the war, they ultimately abandoned it later because they begin to have a problem where their tanks outrun their supply lines. And so literally they get too far and they have to stop and they have to wait for the gas to catch up because they're moving too fast. And they also, at this time, they're using like lighter tanks. And then later on in the war, they begin to develop into the medium and heavier tanks like the Panzer, the Tiger. And these tanks they also kind of abandoned that blitzkrieg tactic because these tanks are too heavy. Not to say that they can't move fast, but they're not as fast as the light tanks. And they also have supply issues throughout the entire war because they're also resource strapped. Um, and oil was another resource they didn't have, that's part of why later on in the war they invade Africa because they're trying to get to the African oil fields.
Now,
And
Anthony, what made World War II even bigger than World War One?
uh, well, so once again, continued technological advancement. In World War One, airplanes were very limited on what they could do. The most common airplane design was what's called a biplane, and in the beginning of the war, they had to do different things with the machine guns because they would shoot through their propellers and destroy the propeller blades. Which I believe was the Germans invented what was called the interrupter gear, which would allow them to, when they pulled the trigger, it would prevent the machine gun from firing when the propeller would come into the way. And so it could literally fire, they would time it so it could fire through the propeller. But by World War II, so you went from biplanes and basically zeppelins, like blimps, to drop bombs and things like that. So now you got World War II where you have, um, monowing aircraft that can fly higher, can fly faster. They're carrying heavier armament. Um, you also begin to have the early developments of jet engine technology, which a lot of that doesn't actually come into the war until the end, especially like with the Messerschmitt 262. Uh, and at that point, it's already kind of too late for the Germans. But like you have these things that are in development that are beginning to change the way war is fought, especially one of the biggest advancements weapon wise that came out of World War II was the German uh, V1 and V2 rockets, because the precursors to um, modern missile technology, especially like weapons that you fire and forget. They go on a line of bearing, or they use a satellite now to find a target and hit it. Uh, and so cruise missile technology, that's essentially the precursor to that. Um, Also, you have the early developments of atomic weaponry. Because even the Germans were conducting heavy water experiments to try to develop an atomic bomb before we did. Now, there was a special operation that was conducted in Norway to destroy that factory, and that was successful, which made it so that the Germans lost pace and they fell behind. But that was a big race as to who could develop the atomic bomb first. Which of course, uh, you know, to this day, the only times atomic weaponry have actually been used in warfare is World War II, when we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Um, but now we live in a world where most major countries have some form of nuclear armament. And for a time, that kind of kept everybody from wanting to fight each other because of this concept of mutually assured destruction. I fire at you, you fire at me, nobody wins. Um, but we're starting to get into an era where they're like, what if we have an enemy who doesn't care if they die,
Mm-hmm.
and is willing to just nuke us, even if they get nuked in return. Um, and so the other thing is that while World War One is mostly a European conflict, there is some fighting in the Pacific. There is some fighting in the Mediterranean and in like uh in what's now Saudi Arabia. it's mostly confined. The major parts of the conflict are confined to kind of the European theater. World War II is literally a world war because you have the European theater, you have the Pacific theater. Because like Japan, not only is Japan invading China, they go on an island hopping campaign and they take islands all throughout Asia, including the Philippines, which at the time in World War II, the Philippines was a colonial possession of the United States. Um, and we had bases there and troops there, and we actually had to retreat. Um, and then we later came back and had to basically fight back. And that was so the first half of the war on the Pacific side for us was basically trying to stop the Japanese Navy. And once we basically had our major turning point battle at the Battle of Midway, where we were able to destroy 3 Japanese aircraft carriers and set a 4th on fire. And that was a huge victory for us. It was costly though. We lost a lot of squadrons in that battle, and we lost one of our aircraft carriers in the process. But after that conflict, the Japanese Navy shifted in its tactics. They weren't able to fight us the same way they had. And then we started our campaign of basically retaking the islands that they had captured. And as that's also going on, then we've also got us, invading, Italy, invading Normandy and these other places. So it literally was war on a worldwide scale. Um, there was very, few areas that weren't in some form of conflict at that time. Uh, and, a lot of that's because of the advances in technology. You know, Aircraft were more reliable, could travel farther. Um, and, especially with the, advances in U-boat technology for the Germans and that, I mean, uh, they were they were sinking merchant vessels all over the place. And then, of course, to counter that, we were able to, us and the Brits were able to develop sonar technology that made it very easy to locate the U-boats. And so the U-boats took heavy losses by the end of the war. Um, Most of the people who started the war in the U-boats didn't survive the war. Um, we became very effective at hunting them. And, so technology, new technology in warfare always leads the advantage, but then new technology is also developed to essentially counter that in warfare. And a lot of times it doesn't develop until it's actually needed. But then once it's needed, it starts to develop. Um, well, it's just like, okay, so in our modern conflicts, some of the most used tactics involves what people call drones. Now in the military, we don't call them drones. That's a misnomer term. That's the civilian term that a lot of people use. We would refer to them as UAVs or unmanned aerial vehicles. But drone warfare, in a sense, is kind of like the warfare of today because they provide a surveillance capability. They have the ability to carry weapons. Because they don't have a pilot, they can loiter in areas for long periods of time, whereas a pilot is going to need to rest eventually. Um, Now, are they the most effective means of fighting warfare? Debatable, because they tend to not be able to carry a lot of ordnance. They're limited by weight and that. So, but they've become a very commonly used tactic. Almost pretty much all the major countries have them now. Whether they've bought them from someone else or they've developed their own. And even some of the smaller adversary nations like Iran and them have their own drone systems. Uh, well, what's interesting is now a common drone tactic is essentially what the Japanese were doing at the end of World War II with kamikazes, where, I'll just fly this drone into your ship and I'll cause much more damage to you that way than if I just shoot a missile at you. Because that jet fuel is going to catch on fire and start a fire, and this big heavy object just slamming into you. Not to say that a missile isn't going to do damage, but and then sometimes it might have missiles or bombs strapped to them and then fly into you. And so that's in current conflict, that's what we're kind of dealing with the Houthis out of Yemen. Is they're shooting missiles and they're launching suicide drones at us and I experienced that myself in 2016. The ship I was on had missiles fired at it, and at that time that wasn't big news. Nobody really talked about it, but now you're hearing about it like every day on the news. And so it just continues to change. And the funny thing is that a lot of people say that we're either on the edge of World War III or we're already in it. We just
No,
haven't officially.
that's scary stuff, really.
Yeah. Well, history is kind of a scary subject. Uh, and what's funny is, in some ways, we're in a similar situation to like a World War I scenario, but we're also in like a similar situation to like a World War II scenario. With the World War I scenario, it's with our treaties. We have a lot of treaties with nations, like, for example, Taiwan. Supposed to defend Taiwan if China tries to invade them. The Philippines, we're supposed to come to the Philippines' aid if China or someone else tries to come to Japan. Japan is technically not allowed to have a military. They can have what's called a self-defense force, but that limits them in what they're allowed to field, and especially their navy. And that was a post-World War II decision. But China is becoming more and more aggressive, and they're starting to wonder if the United States is really going to honor said treaties or not. And of course, we've had this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and that's been kind of a, are we going to go to World War III question since the beginning? Because you've got, we were supplying them with weapons and money. NATO was supplying them with weapons and money. NATO was talking about sending troops, and it's like, hey, this is getting scary. This is getting into a potential world war conflict. And now, I know there's talks of trying to come to some kind of a peace negotiation right now. But who knows? Who knows what's actually going to happen at this point? But I guess that's the other thing too, is like, though these things are scary, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't go on living our lives. Shouldn't live in fear. Uh, Fear will literally kill you. And so we have to continue to, I'm not saying don't be prepared, so to speak, but we can't live our life like, oh my God, tomorrow the world's just going to end. We have to live our life, in a way where it's like, I'm prepared in case the world ends tomorrow, but I'm going to keep living like it's going to go on forever.
No, it's best thing to live in the moment. And
Yeah.
if I could circle back to World War II and Hitler's decisions that shaped the war, what were Hitler's biggest mistakes?
Well, I'm that's a tough one because he made a lot of mistakes, honestly. Uh, you know, Number one, when you vilify like an entire group of people living within your own nation, to put the blame on somebody, that was mistake, I think, number one. You know, and the interesting thing is with how quick the Germans took Poland and France and Belgium and these other places, it took huge territorial gains in a matter of months. primarily because of blitzkrieg tactics. Then they decided we're going to take on Britain. And now the funny thing is that Hitler knew that the German Navy was no match for the British Navy. But his main strategy was, we'll destroy the British Navy from the air. Because at that time, a lot of the navies around the world still had World War I naval tech and hadn't realized that aircraft were going to be the next thing. And that's why like the aircraft carrier became so prominent in World War II. And because of that, a lot of naval ships didn't have a lot of anti-aircraft guns, or they were very like limited. And so the Germans were using bombers and naval bombers, heavy bombers, to basically just destroy the British fleet. And then they began to fly inland, and at first they were only attacking the air bases. But then a mistake was made during a night bombing mission where a German bomber flew over the city of London and decided to drop its bombs. Which, when Hitler found out about that, he decided to change the focus of the bombings from the ships and the airfields to the cities. And the cities were mostly inland. So a lot of these aircraft are flying over like anti-aircraft gunfire and that just to get into the cities. And that kind of allowed the Brits to like redouble their efforts and, basically begin to defeat the Germans in the air. Now, so basically Hitler threw his own plan out about destroying the British Navy in the air. Then, while that's going on, he decides to violate the non-aggression pact he has with Russia and says, you know what, let's go after the Russians too. And begins the land invasion of Russia and also using blitzkrieg tactics. And the crazy thing is that they were within like a 2-day journey of Moscow, the capital of Russia, which had they taken Moscow, the Soviet Union probably would have collapsed or at least fractionalized. And suddenly Hitler has this bright idea that we're going to change what we're doing and we're going to go after this place called Stalingrad. And, Hitler's generals are like, why? There's nothing of strategic value in Stalingrad. And Hitler's response is because it has Stalin's name on it. And so they quickly they leave the invasion of Moscow and just go to Stalingrad, which turns into a disaster for them. And, part of it is because the Russian winter sets in and most of the German troops hadn't been supplied with cold weather gear. So they begin to freeze and starve. And, and as the war goes on, Hitler, who at first had been kind of praised for his military genius, begins to be like, his own generals begin to be like, is this guy insane? And that's why, like, near the end of the war, some of his own leadership conspired to assassinate him, which, if you've ever seen the movie Valkyrie with Tom Cruise, that's what that's about. It's about the plot to assassinate Hitler. And it almost succeeded. They were able to injure Hitler, but they weren't able to kill him. Usually they used a bomb in a suitcase or a briefcase, and it created a concussion blast inside a bunker that it was able to injure him, but it didn't kill him. And because of that, all those guys got rounded up and called a lead butterfly to the head. Uh, and then also, Rommel, one of Hitler's favorite generals, and who had been one of his best, uh, generals in the field. It came to Hitler's knowledge that while Rommel might not have actively participated, he was aware of the plot and didn't do anything to stop it. And so Rommel was confronted by SS and was told, if you come quietly with us, we'll let your family live. But you're going to have to kill yourself. And so, Rommel went with them so his family would be spared and took his own life. But his family was taken to a re-education camp to basically be brainwashed completely into the Hitler mentality. But it was only a few months later, you know, when, you know, as us and the Soviets were closing in on Berlin, that Hitler, went into a bunker with his girlfriend and they both killed themselves.
That's incredible information you just shared there. I know a lot of listeners will appreciate your knowledge on all this. Now, what is one of the most surprising parts of World War II history for you?
Um, Probably one of the most surprising, and this happened in the last few months of the war. There's a battle known as the Battle of Castle Itter. And it is I believe this is the only documented time during World War II where German Wehrmacht soldiers joined forces with American GIs to fight Waffen SS. And it's I'm surprised they haven't made a movie out of this because it sounds like something that would be unbelievable. But yeah, it basically goes that uh, a German SS officer who was secretly part of the French underground resistance basically, rounded up loyal soldiers, and was like, look, we're losing this war. The only way that we're going to survive this is if we make friends with the Americans. And this castle that they were holding on to was kind of being used as a political prisoners castle for like some French VIPs and other people. And so they had a runner go out and basically, wave a white flag in front of the Americans to be like, hey, don't shoot me, but by the way, we want to defect, and we've got these people here that are prisoners that we want to give to you. And at first the Americans were like, this sounds like a trap. But the commander of the tank group that was there, he's like, well, let's go check this out. And, so they went and they saw that the Germans were telling the truth. And, as they were there, though, an SS battalion came across them and began to attack them. And so you had Americans and Germans fighting side by side against the Waffen SS, and, and even giving their lives, uh, because in their mind, they're like, they would rather die as like true Germans and not be part of this Nazi nonsense. Um, and save these people that they thought were wrongly, imprisoned. And so, yeah, it's amazing that of all the things they could have made a movie about, they haven't made a movie about this. Um, and, but yeah, it's also similar to, can't remember his name right now, but there was a German pilot in World War II, uh, who had the opportunity to shoot down a B-17 that was heavily damaged. And had he done so, he would have been awarded like a Knight's Cross, their version of the Medal of Honor. But as he got close, he saw that like the plane was barely flying, the people inside were injured, and he chose to spare their lives. And he flew them out of German airspace, basically escort style, and waited till they were over the sea to then turn around. And that pilot and the B-17 pilot years later met each other, because he started writing letters looking for this guy, and he said, "I'm the guy that spared you." And so they met each other and became friends, and they remained friends until they both died just a few years ago.
How did World War II shape the world we live today?
Well, so not only, as I was mentioning before, you have modern Germany, modern Japan are basically byproducts of World War II. Uh, the United Nations is a post-World War II organization. Now, there was a predecessor to that, which was called the League of Nations, which was formed post-World War One, and then it was reformed into the United Nations after World War II. And you also have, the Cold War goes into effect. One of the biggest aspects of the Cold War being the space race, which, once again, that's all World War II rocket technology in a sense, even, basically the brainchild behind NASA's rocket program was Werner von Braun, who was head of the Nazi German V2 rocket program. And so, and then a lot of his counterparts were captured by the Russians. And so it was basically a game of uh, whose German scientists could out German each other. Um, and, like the space race brought upon a ton of technological advancements. I believe microwave technology was invented, for astronauts and so that they could heat their food. And all other kinds of technology came out of that and, really pushed technology forward. And, now we're kind of entering a new space era, but it's more civilian sponsored than government sponsored. Uh, and there's debate as to like, should that be the way things are or not? Um, I don't know. That's not for me to say. But we live in an age where the technologies we take for granted a majority of them came out of solving a world or like a war problem or solving um like another problem that like in space. How do you heat food in space? You can't really fry food in space and stuff like that. um and yeah, and so I mean, you know uh even this recording we're doing right now, this video teleconferencing probably started off as a military technology at one point that then became civilian.
No, that's really good insight. And the definition of war, isn't it just two opposing sides fighting over the same thing?
Well, I mean, there are many reasons for war. Sometimes it's over resources, sometimes it's ideology, sometimes it doesn't seem to be a reason, it just happens. Um, I think probably one of the best definitions of war that was ever mentioned, it came out of the American Civil War, and it simply says war is hell.
No, that's perfectly put. Now, I know you love history as much as I do, but if you could go back in time and witness one event, what would it be?
Just one, huh? Okay. I guess for me, if it's something in like the past 100 years, I think it would have been really cool to actually watch the moon landing occur. And that's something that I think a lot of people don't care about or take for granted, but that was a huge um achievement. And especially the amount of manpower and computing power and the teams of people that had to come together to make that one thing happen.
No, it's a point in history that really shifted a lot of people's perspective on space.
Mhm.
Now, Anthony, what's next for you on your journey?
Well, as I said, I'm in between jobs at the moment, but I plan on continuing to write, uh, and always kind of expand my knowledge on things, and just kind of go where God leads me.
No, this has been an incredible conversation with you, Anthony. I appreciate you being on the show, and your knowledge of history and faith has given us a lot to think about. I really do appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be on the show.
No, and I know a lot of listeners got a lot of value out of this, and I appreciate you being here. And for the listeners, stay tuned for even more amazing stories like this on Every Day is Friday Podcast 365. Thank you for listening, and until next time, everybody.
All right. Thank you. Goodbye.